Okay, we are back, and the next thing I want to talk about is working with 3D objects inside of Maya. Some of this we've already seen to a limited degree, but we're going to focus on it just a little bit more. Let me go ahead and go to File, New. I'm not going to save, of course. And I'm going to create a brand new block in the middle of my scene. Just like we did before, I'll hit 5 to shade up the view. Now, what I want to talk about are some of the basics of moving, rotating, and scaling. We've seen this a little bit with the toolbox. We can click on the Move tool, the Rotate tool, or the Scale tool to jump in between those three widgets. Those also have associated hotkeys being W for Move, E for Rotate, and R for Scale. I want to point out something super critical in Maya that is super easy to overlook and will give you extreme migraine headaches if you forget about it. Maya is case sensitive. Why is that important? Why do you care? I will show you why you care and why it's important, because if I hit lowercase w, I go to the Move tool. If I hit uppercase W with the caps lock key down, then what I do instead, well, actually, they've solved that, so it's actually Shift W these days. I'm so glad they fixed that. But if you hit Shift W, like to make a capital W, then you will be creating a keyframe. So watch out for that. Right now, if you take a look over here in the channel box, I am keyframing Translate. If I hit Shift E, I'm keyframing Rotate. And if I hit Shift R, I'm keyframing Scale. So watch the difference between uppercase and lowercase. It looks like they did finally, and it might have been as of 2013 for all I know. I got so out of the habit of doing it. But for a long time when you were using Maya, if you had your caps lock key down and you started spamming buttons, you'd get huge headaches because you'd keyframe everything. So I still try to warn people about that. And just remember that Maya is generally case sensitive about everything. So let's talk about these tools for just a moment, starting with the Move tool. If you hit W, of course, you're in the Move tool. It gives you 3 axes that you can drag the object around on, or you can grab the little square in the center and move in screen space. If you hold down Control and click on any one of the axes, you'll nullify that axis so that when you grab the little yellow square in the middle, you're only moving on 2 axes. If you want to set it back, just Control-click on the yellow square again. Okay? Also, you can hold down the W key and left mouse, and this is going to bring up what is called a marking menu. For those of you who've been playing with console games over the last X number of years, you've probably seen these because they're getting pretty popular on like Xbox and PlayStation games. But this allows you to change several settings about how the Move tool works. Do you want it to have reflection? What axis do you want it to reflect around? Do you want it to be in object or world space? Now, is there anybody out there who does not know, you can tell me inside of BuzzNet, please, who does not know the difference between world space and object space? Because I can make it really clear, really quick and easy if you don't know. Okay, so there's a couple of people who don't. In the lower left-hand corner of your view are the world axes. This tells you what way is pointing up, what way is pointing down the z-axis, what way is pointing down the x-axis, and so on. And right now you'll notice that the Move tool currently corresponds to those axes. Y points up, so does it on the Move tool. What did we hold down for the marking menu? What button are we using to hit the Move tool, Wick? You tell me. You're in the hot seat now. You have drawn the Eye of Sauron down upon you. Yep, W. Just hold down W. It makes sense if you think about it. And there's actually another menu for if you hold down E and another one for R, just for whatever tool you happen to be holding. It's very convenient, but it does take a second. Okay, so right now you'll notice the Move tool is oriented with the world axes. If I take this cube and I rotate it, which I'm just going to do with the Rotate tool, meaning I just hit E and grab some of these rings and rotate them around a little bit, and go back to the Move tool, notice that the Move tool is still oriented with the world axes. If I hold down W and left mouse, you see that we're currently in world mode. If I switch this to object mode, however, take a look. The Move tool has now updated so that Y points this way, Z points this way, and X points this way. The difference is that world will always be aligned to the true world directions of X, Y, and Z, and the axes that they represent. Object space updates based on the rotation of the object. So it's kind of like if you're floating out in space. In the middle of space, do up and down actually mean anything? No, up is whatever direction your head happens to be pointing. That's kind of like how object space works. Whatever direction your object seems to be facing, that's the direction it'll go when you try to move it up along the y-axis. If you want to move in the constant world coordinates, just switch it over to world. And there you go. Now I'm going to tap undo a few times. And before we get too carried away, let me talk about undo real quick, because there are a few things in Maya that are as important as being able to undo. If you go under Edit, you guys will notice that Control-Z and Control-Y are undo and redo, like every other application in the world, right? Well, it turns out there's an old-school way to do undo and redo in Maya that me, personally, I like better. If you do anything you don't want to do in Maya that you want to undo, just tap the Z key. You don't have to worry about hitting Control. You can just hit Z. If you want to redo, you can hit Shift-Z. Now me, I find Shift-Z a lot more convenient than Control-Y, but that's just me. In Photoshop, Control-Shift-Z is actually stepping back in history. That's not necessarily undo. In Photoshop, undo is Control-Z. And if someone would please like to give me an O snap. Thank you, Wick. Good. I need somebody to throw an O snap in there. All right, so now with that, that's undo and redo. There's another aspect of undoing. I'm sorry, I'm horrible. It's super important. It's easy to overlook and forget about. But if you go open up your preferences, which everybody hopefully remembers, the little running in Television Man in the lower right-hand corner. Open up your preferences and take a look at undo. By default, you're probably set to finite undos with a queue size of about 50. If you're running a modern machine, set that to infinity or infinite and save it. Because let me tell you, if you really screw something up, 50 undos, you'll burn through that in a heartbeat. And you'll still have stuff that you need to undo. So set it over to infinite and forget about it. And it'll make your life a whole lot easier. Trust me, trust me, trust me. It's not really infinite. You will eventually run out of undos, but you'll get a whole lot more undos out of it. All right, so there's the basics of the move tool, okay? Now, please note, I just want to mention this. You can punch in values directly into the channel box if you want to. So, I mean, we could set everything to 0, 0, 0, and I'm just hitting Tab to run down these. You can also, and this is just kind of a semi-advanced trick. Let's say I want to change translate X, Y, and Z to 0. Watch this. Drag down to the last one I want to change and change it to 0, and it'll update everybody above it. That is pretty fancy. So if you have like moved and rotated something to some weird direction and you want to just reset all of this, drag down to there, hit 0, boom, and it just updates everyone. You also need to know about the virtual slider. That's a little feature with the channel box where you can select any one of these attributes and then just middle mouse drag to update them. And that's very, very handy as well. Okay, I got to kind of move along a little bit. Let's take a look at the rotate tool. The rotate tool gives you 3 concentric rings, one representing each axis, and you can use it to rotate around those axes. Just like the move tool, it can be set to object mode or world mode. And if it's in in local space, you'll see that those rings will constantly update around the object. Now, this is kind of an advanced topic that it's outside of our scope, and I don't want to get too far into it, but for those of you who are familiar with other 3D animation softwares that use the Euler rotation algorithm, Maya does suffer from gimbal lock. It does happen. You can get around this by either switching to quaternions or using a parenting hierarchy to get around various forms of rotation. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, do not stress. It's not something that you need to be worried about this early in your career. But I realize there are some people who are trying to get up to speed in Maya who've been using other forms of 3D application who are familiar with Euler. It's actually spelled Euler, E-U-L-E-R, but like so many of the fancy names out there, it's got a funny pronunciation. Like my favorite is Fresnel, which if you ever pronounce it Fresnel, you'll probably get punched by somebody from France because it's Fresnel. It's F-R-E-S-N-E-L, but it's Fresnel. Anyway, so that's the basics of the rotate tool. Again, you can just rotate around each one of those axes. You can also rotate around the big blue axis on the outside and you're spinning in screen space. It's almost like if you were spinning around a pin that was going straight out of the camera, which is pretty cool. Also, this will save your life, or at least spare you some frustration. When you're rotating, if you hold down, hang on, Marilyn said, I do not see the world object choices when I right-click. I don't know what you're talking about. Hold down E and left mouse. We weren't using the right mouse button at all, just so you know. We had 3 tools that we've discussed: move, rotate, and scale attached to W, E, and R. If you hold down the respective key for each tool and the left mouse button, you'll get this little menu that pops up. Ty just said, can you zero out your channel values to reset their home values, i.e. move your cube above the grid, and you want that to be your new zeroed location? You mean something like come over here and go to modify and choose freeze transform so that now that's 0. Yeah, once again, that is modify, freeze transforms. That's huge. I use it all the bloody time. And no, you don't have to do like the old slow way in Max where you'd have to parent it to a null and hide it out and all kinds of crazy jacked up stuff like that. Okay, now that I've had that little rant and I feel a little bit better. Okay, so where was I real quick? Okay, so we were rotating around some things. Please make a note of this. You can hold down the J key. And take a look at my rotate X right now while I'm rotating. I'm getting incremental rotations. That's with J. That gives you nice discrete rotations. You can turn that on or off. If you hold down the E key, you'll see discrete rotate. And I want to point this out. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you've got the show or hide tool settings. So if you open this up and you turn on discrete rotate, you can change that step size. I think by default it's set to 15 degrees. I never use that. I always set mine down to 5. But again, that's under your tool settings. So upper right-hand corner, click on tool settings, turn on discrete rotate, change your step size, and turn it back off. Then that way you can only use it, or you can choose. This is the way I like to use it. I use it just by holding down the J key when I need a discrete rotation. So there you go. Okay, and then finally we have scale. Scale gives you 3 cubes where you can scale on each one of the axes. Pretty straightforward. Or you can grab the one in the middle and you can scale uniformly. That's really about the bulk of it. That's pretty much everything one would need to know. Other than if you're totally new to working in 3D space, if you ever want to reset your scale, it resets to 1, not 0. Because if you rescale something to 0, it pretty much doesn't exist. 1 is your base scale. Okay, so that's moving, rotating, and scaling. The next thing I want to talk about is parenting objects inside of Maya. So if you have any questions about moving, rotating, and scaling, throw them into the webinar system now, because I'm going to be going ahead and moving on a little bit. Parenting in Maya, or parenting in most applications actually, is a special relationship that you're familiar with whether you know it or not. Let me see if I can find a relatively empty area. Here's my favorite way to explain parenting. Let's say that this hideous monstrosity that I'm making here is okay. This obviously isn't the Earth, but it's like the Earth. It's a planet. Actually, it looks like that funny thing where it's like, do you see a candlestick or 2 yelling people? Anyway, so this is the Earth, and here is you standing on the Earth, dying of asphyxiation because you're apparently so tall that your head sticks out into space. But just go with me on this, right? The Earth is constantly spinning around, and it's hurtling through space. It's got all this motion to it, and are you aware of any of that motion? Now, Marilyn just asked, can scaling be constrained? That's a really big word. When you say something like constrained, can you be more specific? Because if you mean constrain it to a single axis, that's by grabbing one of the axes and going from there. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say constrained. I'm giving Marilyn a second to catch up and give me a clearer explanation of what her question is so that I can answer it more carefully. I mean, I can do a scale constraint to another object, where if I scale one object, I scale the other, but that's a little bit outside the scope of our lesson right now. If you mean discrete scaling, because I'm just trying to fill in for you because I'm not getting anything back, keep the square square. Sure, grab the center. And that's uniform scaling. So you have any one of the individual axes, or you have the center. Now if you hold down the R key, you have the ability for snap scaling, and that will give you 1 unit increments by default, or kind of like 100% increments. And that may have been what you were talking about, but I guess not now. Okay, so back over here. And actually, people even answered my question, which made me very happy. No, you're completely unaware of the fact that the Earth is hurtling through space as fast as it is. That's because it's kind of like the Earth is the parent of you. Wherever the Earth goes, you're going to go right along. And that's how parenting works in Maya as well. Let me go ahead and give you a quick demonstration. I'm going to create a sphere, like so. I'm just going to put it up here in the air. I'm going to grab this block. I'm going to hold down Shift and select this sphere and hit P for parent. Now, if I select the sphere, it looks like both objects are selected. If I move the sphere, the block comes along. If I rotate the sphere, the block comes along. If I scale the sphere, the block gets bigger and smaller. Right now, this sphere is kind of like the block's entire universe. Everywhere the block goes is now in relation to its parent, or in relation to this sphere. Here's what I mean. Watch this. I went to wireframe mode by tapping the 4 key. If I now take my translates and set them all to 0, where do you think this box is going to go? No, just P, not Shift and P. Somebody tell me where you think this box is going to go. Just guess if you don't know. Throw a rock at it, see what you hit. Into the sphere. Wick may be all over it. Let's go ahead and see. We hit 0 and press enter. Well, he's a little bit off, but and that's actually Wick's fault because we froze the transforms of that block earlier, so I'm going to consider that a defective block right now. We're going to make a brand new block. And I'm going to parent that to the sphere by selecting it and hitting P. Hey, don't laugh, Wick. It meant you were wrong. So now, if I do that again, I set the translates over to 0, the block goes right inside to the center of the sphere. That's because when you parent an object to another object, the child is basically, that child's entire universe is based on that parent. Wherever the parent goes, the child will go too. But it's a one-way relationship. What I mean when I say that is that wherever the parent goes, obviously the child is coming along. But when I move the child, the parent is just staying in place. Because right now, that child's entire transformation, and whenever I say transform, I mean translate, rotate, and scale. So all of his transformations are based on that parent. It is kind of like life. Wherever the parent goes, the kids go along, but the kids kind of run around like crazy on their own within the parent's vicinity. But keep an eye on this, for instance. Right now, let's take a look at our cube. And what I'm going to do is move his transforms to something kind of static that's easy to remember, okay? So he's at 10, 10, and 10, and you can see kind of where he is. Now, if I move this sphere over here, what do you expect the block's transforms to be? If I select again, they're still 10, 10, 10. Take a look at his rotations. They're all 0. But if I take the sphere and rotate it, and take a look at the block still hasn't rotated. Again, it's just like the Earth. The Earth is constantly spinning, and it's revolving, and it's flying, and it's doing all these great things. But we're totally unaware of it, just like the child in this relationship. Does this make sense to everyone? Good. Now you can have multiple tiers of hierarchies in this example. So for instance, if I was to create some cones, or try to, actually let's do pyramids. They're faster. So I'm just going to hit Y a few times and drag out some pyramids. That kind of looks like Giza. And we'll pull those up into the air. But then I'm going to hold down Shift and parent all of these to the block. Now, wherever the block goes, the pyramids go. Wherever the sphere goes, everybody goes. Because we have a relationship that is something like this. The sphere, the block, a pyramid, a pyramid, a pyramid, and a pyramid. And all these pyramids are equal siblings. A Kung Pao moment. SJC, give yourself a high five. That's pretty amazing. Note they are not instances. Instances are a whole different creature. These are just, in this case, they're just different objects. So you got to be careful with your terminology. We're not going to be getting into instances tonight, but instances are objects that share the same shape node. But anyway, actually, let me undo that. Let me keep all these guys out for just a moment. And this allows me to segue into Maya's architecture and the two graphs that are available in Maya. If you go to Window, you'll see that the hypergraph comes in two flavors. We have the hierarchy and we have connections. The hierarchy gives us a breakdown of all of the objects in our scene and how they are parented to one another. So here we see that exact same thing I just drew in Photoshop a moment ago. The sphere, who's the parent of the cube, who's the parent of all four of these pyramids. This is the purpose of the hierarchy. This is the DAG, the DAG, the Directed Acyclic Graph. For now, let's just call it the hierarchy. However, that's not all we have access to in Maya. Let me grab one of these pyramids, and if we go back over to Window, we can open up the hypergraph in the flavor of connections. This is the dependency graph. This is Maya showing you all of the nodes that make up this pyramid. And by default, on a new object, there are 4 of them. And I want to take just a minute and explain what all 4 of these nodes are and what their jobs are. We're going to go through it fairly quickly, though. We have an input node, a shape node, a shading group node, and a transform node. Now, let's jot that out over inside of Photoshop. In fact, see, we don't need all this stuff anymore. Just nuke all this out. Give me a nice, clean spot to work. We have an input node, which is feeding data into a shape node, and those arrows are actually there inside of Maya as well. The shape node is feeding data into a shading group, and then we have a transform node, which doesn't appear to be connected to anybody, though he is internally. So, what is the job of all of these nodes? I like to think of this like a construction site. The input node is kind of like a set of blueprints. It has all of the data for whatever it is you're trying to make. So for instance, if we jump back over to Maya, here's our input node, Polypyramid 3. Well, let's take a look at that. If I take my hypergraph and I make it kind of small and leave the two side by side. So now if I select this input node, take a look at what we have in the channel box. Look at the properties. Side length, number of sides, subdivisions height, and subdivisions caps. Those are all important properties that you would need if you were building a pyramid. So it's just like the blueprints. Now, next, we have the shape node. The shape node is kind of like the brick and mortar. This is the object itself. In Maya terms, in actual technical terms, the shape node contains all of the vertex information that builds this object into something that you can interact with. Next, we have the shading group node. This is like your paint. Controls how shiny something is, what color it is, if it looks like it's lumpy or bumpy or has anything fancy going on. That's all contained in the shading group node. Then finally, we have the transform node. And this is all about placement in our world. So if you think of Maya as building like modular homes, you have the blueprints, then at the factory they build it, then somebody comes along and paints it, then they load it up on a truck and they move it someplace, and that's exactly what Maya is doing. And this relationship never goes away. How do you undo parenting? Really quick, I just happened to see that over inside of BuzzNet. If you really need to undo, there's a couple of different ways to do it. One way is to select a child and hit Shift key. You'll find that relationship very often in Maya. The opposite of a hotkey is generally Shift and that hotkey. It's very common. Another way to do it is, if you recall going into the hierarchy view, you can take whatever you don't want to be a child anymore and just middle mouse drag it out into space, and that will undo the parenting as well. Good question. So, back over here inside the hierarchy. Now, as I mentioned, we have the blueprints, we have the brick and mortar, we have the paint, and then we have the positioning. This relationship never goes away. For instance, if I take this pyramid, and I'm going to do something fancy, and I really don't want you to follow along, unless you just really feel comfortable with it. I'm going to right-click and choose Faces. I'm going to grab this face on the bottom, hit Shift and right mouse, and I'm going to extrude it out a little bit. I'm going to grab this face, and I'll extrude these out a little bit. Excuse me. And then I'll grab these two faces, and I'll extrude these out a little bit. So I've just made this whole new thing out of my object. But let's go back and take a look at this object's connection. So I'll select it, and let's just reopen the window. I'm going to go to Window, Connections one more time. And now we're starting to get this really interesting network of nodes. Instead of just an input node, we have different nodes for each one of these poly-extrude operations. So every time I did an extrusion, we got another node that contained all of the data for that extrusion. And it doesn't even really go against our analogy. If we were saying this is like blueprints, what we're doing now is we have our initial input node for making a pyramid. So I'll just kind of put that in here. So this is pyramid. And now we have a node for an extrusion, which I'm going to abbreviate just for sake of brevity. So we're taking the data from the original blueprints for our pyramid. Those are getting fed through one extrusion, through another extrusion, then through another extrusion, and then that is getting fed into the shape node. If this were like the real world, this would be like you're getting new parts of the blueprints added onto the original designs. Like somebody comes onto the construction site and says, hey guys, good job with that pyramid, but somebody says we got to build a basement and it's got to be extended and it's got to go down a couple hundred floors. Exactly, it's just like blueprint revisions. Now, all of this, everything that's gone on, is being kept inside these nodes. And this is called construction history. That's actually the Maya term. So our little analogy where we use like a construction site, it's more valid than you'd like to think at first, because this is all called construction history. The great thing about construction history is that we can use it to kind of go back in time and make changes to an object. So notice my very first input node was the polypyramid node. Over here in the channel box, I can select that. I can take the side length and increase it. And it's just like going back in time and building a bigger pyramid before we did anything else. Now, there's a couple of other kind of caveats to this. If you change the number of vertices in construction history, you will get funny results. For instance, if I take the subdivision's height and increase it, take a look at what happens. The reason for this is that all of these faces that I was extruding all have ID numbers. And as we increase the number of divisions back in history, we're changing those ID numbers. So it's like in this case, Maya knows that I selected face number 4 and extruded it. Then I selected faces number 6 and 7 and I extruded those. And then I grabbed 11 and 14 and I extruded those. But if I change the total number of faces that I have, then 4 was somewhere else, 9 was somewhere else, 16 was somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So you got to be really careful about changing the number of vertices back in history. But things like overall size, you can change that kind of stuff all day long if you want to. Does that make sense to everyone? Let's see, Ty said, do all those nodes show up as tabs in your attribute editor? Well, let's check, Ty. Pyramid 3, pyramid shape 3, poly extrude face 3, 2, 1, notice the little arrows that I'm using to navigate. They're all there. All right, now, here's the catch. That's the nice part of construction history, that we can go back, even right back to this extrusion. Check this out. You all saw, you might have seen the tool that I used to make that extrusion. Watch this. I can go back to an extrusion and hit T for the Show Manipulator tool, and I can change that extrusion. Just like going back in time. That's the cool part about extrusion. Who can tell me the bad part about construction history in this sense? You see why it's good, why is it bad? Boom, Wick is kind of onto something. As this starts to pile up on multiple objects across your scene, it starts to eat up a lot of precious computer resources. Construction history can bog down your computer and it can crash Maya. So you have to be very careful with that. I won't go so far as to say it can screw things up. Generally, I find that if history is screwing something up, it's because of user error. But all things aside, its biggest problem is that it will slow down your machine. So you will find yourself having to delete construction history. It's very important that you see how to do this, so please make a note. Select an object. Go under Edit, Delete by Type, and choose History. Risen Force, you're leaving me for Doctor Who? Ugh. So, now I have deleted my history. Notice all of those nodes are gone. Now, what does that actually mean? What it means is, just like when you get done building something in the real world, do you still need the blueprints? I mean, yeah, and for a lot of legal purposes, people hold on to them. But technically speaking, you don't really need them anymore. So what Maya does is it takes all the information, everything before the shape node, it bundles that up, stores it permanently in the shape node, and then wipes all this stuff out. So that all you have left is a shape node, a shading group node, and then your transform node. Which if I go back over to Maya now, we can confirm this. Let's go to Window and open up the connections again. I have a shape node, a shading group node, and a transform node. And that's it. If you just delete an object, does it not delete the history associated with it? Yes, it does. It will delete the history associated with it. As a matter of fact, you have to be kind of careful in this, especially in terms of parenting, because if I select a parent and delete it, it's also going to delete the children. And Wick said, so it's like merge layers in Photoshop. That's dead on. That's a great analogy. Okay, so there is your quick, down and dirty introduction to construction history in Maya. And with that, we are now ready to begin working on a very simple introductory project in Maya. So for those of you who are totally new, and Risen Force is very much like Flatten, for those of you who are totally new, this should be a lot of fun. And you get to walk away from this with something that you can show all of your friends. So I'm going to do a really quick ready status check to see who's ready to begin the project right now. Good. The biggest reason I did that was just to see who's following along and who isn't. And it looks like everybody who's hit participate is following along. And for that, I cannot even express how grateful I am. Now, that said, we are going to take a very, very quick break, just a couple of minutes, because I want the project to actually begin on its own video. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video, and we'll begin here in just a moment. So